On behalf of the Jesuit Schools Network Conference Office, welcome to our latest virtual Ignatian Inquiry session. As you know, the JSN seeks to be a supportive resource to our member schools, and this virtual session is designed to be just that, a carved out space to listen, to learn, and to engage. So we are happy you're here. We're eager to encourage a spirit of inquiry across the many layers of our work in Jesuit education, and we envision our particular brand of Ignatian inquiry to be the art of inquiry as seen through our Ignatian lens, asking questions and exploring issues that matter in our schools through the frame of our shared Jesuit mission. For those of you that I do not know, and so many I do, I'm happy to see you. I am Kristin Cully, and I serve as Director of Inquiry and New Ventures with the JSN Conference Office. And I'd like to thank my colleague on the call here, Kristin Smith, who leads all things communication for the JSN, and she'll help us enjoy a smooth afternoon here together. If we can begin, please, with a prayer, one that I always enjoy. So if we can quiet ourselves and be reminded that in being together this afternoon, we are in the presence of God. In the name of the Father and Son and Holy Spirit. And let us pray in particular for all those children who are struggling in our world today. I'd like to just read a beautiful reading that I very much enjoy from Father Henri Nguyen that I think is fitting for this time of year. Often we want to be able to see into the future. We say, how will next year be for me? Where will I be 5 or 10 years from now? There are no answers to these questions. Mostly we have just enough light to see the next step, what we have to do in the coming hour or the following day. The art of living is to enjoy what we can see and not complain about what remains in the dark. When we are able to take the next step with the trust that we will have enough light for the step that follows, we can walk through life with joy and be surprised at how far we go. Let's rejoice in the light we carry and not ask for the great beam that will take all the shadows away. And let's pray especially for the grace of imagination, of creativity, and of patience. Amen. It is my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker for this afternoon, who many of you know, and who has really been a wonderful partner for several years now to the Jesuit Schools Network. His session is entitled Coming of Age in 2022, leveraging research and development to foster young people's restoration and thriving. Drawing on his own research and broader trends, Dr. Gabriel Velez will share about the current landscape in research and thinking on what young people are going through, given the complexities of the last few years. Much of the conversation around young people has been about the crises and challenges they face. While the struggles are very real, Dr. Velez will highlight some ways that young people are describing how they make sense and are coping, with implications for how Ignatian educators can think about responding and supporting them. The presentation will be centered on 2 main questions. How do we put things back together in ways that are better than before? And how do we help kids restore their sense of well-being? Dr. Gabriel Velez, PhD, is an assistant professor and developmental psychologist in the Department of Educational Policy and Leadership in the College of Education at Marquette University. He also serves as the faculty director of the Black and Latina Ecosystem and Support Transition Hub at Marquette, and the chair of the faculty research team for the Center for Peacemaking. Dr. Velez studies identity development in adolescence, particularly in relation to educational experiences and transitions. He has collaborated extensively with schools and nonprofit educational organizations in Milwaukee and Columbia, including consulting and overseeing implementation and evaluation of restorative justice and peace education. He was recently awarded a Spencer Foundation small research grant to study Black and Latina student perceptions and meaning making of school-based restorative justice. Dr. Velez's published works include a co-edited volume, Restorative Justice, Promoting Peace and Wellbeing, and a current book in development entitled Making Meaning of Justice and Peace, a Developmental Lens to Restorative Justice and Peace Education with Cambridge University Press. Dr. Velez graduated from Regis High School in 2003 and then earned a BA in History and Literature from Harvard University and an MA and PhD in Comparative Human Development from the University of Chicago. Between time as an undergrad and his doctoral studies, Dr. Velez taught at a Nativity Network school in Harlem and spent 2 years in Peru serving as a Jesuit volunteer. Several years back, at the start of the pandemic, Gabriel reached out to the JSN to inquire if we would be interested in being a part of his research study at the time that explored the effects of COVID-19 on adolescents' perspectives of the world. Many of you will remember that as your schools were participants in that study and have continued to engage with Dr. Velez and that work supporting kids. We have continued to work together in various ways, supporting schools in these many years since. And he was most recently our keynote speaker at our principal's Ignatian colleagues gathering just a few weeks ago in Winnipeg. So I'll turn it over now to Dr. Velez to begin his work.
Thank you, Kristin. And thank you all for coming out, particularly on this Thanksgiving weekend, week, when I know that it's a busy time. And for all of you who are World Cup fans like me, it's time when the United States is starting their trajectory, hopefully, and going deep. But I really appreciate it. And I want to, kind of start things off as I share my screen by really just offering myself as a resource and saying that I really want this to be, I'm going to share some, the insights and work that I've done, but kind of this to be a conversation. And I'm really happy to follow up or engage or receive any feedback, at the end or after as well. Some of you on here, I know I see some folks who I regularly am in communication with and have done some work with at your school level. And I really want to open up that invitation to everyone. And so I'm hoping to get through a little bit, a decent amount today, but kind of to show you to kind of set the stage a little bit, then talk a little bit about kind of development and resilience and thinking about that framework with everything that's gone on the last 2 years. And then draw on my own research and kind of broadly on some of the research that I've been reading about and hearing about and trying to follow on what the last 2 years have been like, and then end with that really sort of concrete, what can we do to support students? And so Kristin gave me a really great introduction, but I wanted to highlight a few things out of there. I still very much identify as a teacher. I'm no longer in the classroom, and I kind of crave every opportunity to get back into a school to do research and to work with young people. But that's really my background. I was a teacher for 6 years across those different settings, and that really has informed my own thinking. And here are two of the settings. One was in Peru that was on the left, and on the right was one in Colombia. And to give you kind of a sense, of how diverse those different settings were. And so, as I kind of come at the work that I do, I think about often the applied context, the work of teachers, the work of schools, but also the ways that we have such similar and then also different experiences with the young people that we're working with, and how do we hold that together, that kind of diversity, but then also something shared and universal. The other part that's happened more recently is that I have 2 young kids. And so as this developmental psychologist, I've come to learn that the gap from like sitting here, and talking about something and then to the actual work and to seeing it happen can be very complicated, right? And so, with my kids, I know exactly what's going on with them, like in terms of, I know intellectually, I've read about it, I understand it. Trying to act in that moment in a way that's responsive to it can be really hard. And so part of that is to say some of the things I may talk about and offer, I understand we're sitting here in a space that's disconnected from, in some ways, the everyday experience of actually working with young people and kids. And sometimes that can be a lot more complicated than just sort of saying the words and talking about it. So the guiding motivation, as Kristin mentioned, there's sort of 2 things. Think about this idea of how can we put things back together? So not a sense of like normality, but a sense of like, how can we actually move forward and move sort of up and move on and progress in a way that we take these lessons and kind of build a stronger foundation for our young people and in the ways that we support them. And then with that kind of in mind, how we can help restore a sense of well-being, because that has clearly been disrupted, particularly by 2020, but I think generally by a lot of challenges that have happened over the last couple of years. And so there's kind of this idea of how can we focus on some of the positive things, on the resilience, on the well-being, but keeping in mind and holding the extreme challenge and disruption that has taken place. And so as an opening sort of reflection, I'm going to give you all a chance to engage a little bit. I'm going to ask you to go to menti.com and use this code 6320-0165. And I'm going to ask you to, to respond to this question. What words or phrases come to mind when you think about the experience of adolescence during the last 2.5 years? So kind of since the start of the pandemic. And feel free to respond multiple times if you want to this idea of what do you think about, or what words come to mind when you think about the experience of adolescence during the last 2.5 years. And so as folks are responding, it's populating there. As you can see, a word cloud. So the idea, if you're not familiar with that, is when multiple words or phrases are put in by the same person, it'll come up larger, and then it's trying to sort of capture all of the different ideas that you're all saying. Now, sometimes it doesn't do a good job reading the similar words, so you'll see like isolation there and isolated, so those would be grouped together, but it's not doing that. But we see a lot of things that I think are common themes, and these are the type of things we hear about, right? Here, see isolated and isolation, like I said, challenges, unpredictable, fragmented, disjointed, some things related to social skills attrition, antisocial, some things related to academic, like learning loss. There's a lot of that sense, I think, of that unpredictable, or I see irregularity or roller coaster, right? Looking for stability. I see a few things related to mental health too, like mental health, anxious, as well. And so I think, this is kind of to try and get a sense of how we're all thinking about this, but these I think are both real, these kind of experiences, and they're also the ones that are out there, right? In the sense of these are the ones that are really being emphasized and propagated, I think, in the media as well. And so, if we put these words into a search engine and said young people, we'd find a number of stories related to these questions over the last couple of years. And that's because it is real, like that's a real part of that experience. Now, returning kind of to then sort of thinking about that context and how we're all thinking about these last couple of years, I want to take a step back first and just sort of talk about development generally. So, if we think of kind of like the psychological models, and I was, playing around in my head to do like a pop quiz here and see who remembers from their, it's like grad school or undergrad days about Kohlberg or Piaget or Erikson, but we have these kind of psychological models that lay this groundwork. And there are a couple of things here that I think are important to keep in mind. And one is that when we think of particularly the disruption of the last couple of years, right, that's going to look different dependent on where kids were at. So, if kids were 10 years old when 2020 came around, they were at different stages in their development, right? They had different things going on cognitively. They had different things that they were going on in terms of their kind of psychosocial development. In Erikson, Piaget, and Kohlberg, there's lots of critiques and pushback and things, but it gives us that sense that kids are at different places, right? And we know this. And I think we need to be thinking about that, not just different places sort of individually, but where they are in terms of their age. And for those, particularly for those kids who are in their sort of middle school into high school years, when 2020 hit, right, they were trying to build the sense of industry and identity, right? Identity being really critical there. They're starting to get a sense of like what abstract systems are like, right? What societies are like, right? And then in terms of their moral development, that's a really critical time when they're starting to really come into these grander ideas of what does it mean to be a member of a community, a society. And so this disruption was kind of impacting them in those ways. And then, another one of those sort of Ed Psych 101 models from Brofenbrenner, we also can think about that these kids are individuals, right? And they have stuff going on with each of them with themselves. They have their own personalities, they have their own biologies, but then they're embedded in these systems. And we can really look sort of in that broader one, that chrono system, to be thinking about kids were affected in so many deep ways, but so much of their systems were affected by all these changes, things like the Black Lives Matter movement, the pandemic, and we'll touch on this all in a second, but that then impacted their neighborhoods, their schools, their support systems, then the people in them too, teachers, parents, siblings, friends, right? And so there were these really diverse and multiple ways that these kids were affected across these various systems. And then, I think, there's so much that focuses on that kind of challenge. And one of the takeaways that I want us to be thinking about, or maybe across this presentation, or raise, is the idea of resilience and how we promote it. So I think, starting with a definition, that's one of my things I always kind of go back to, and I think it's important to keep in mind. And so here I'm drawing on the American Psychological Association, and they defined it as the process and outcome of successfully adapting to difficult or challenging life experiences. And that's especially through mental, emotional, and behavioral flexibility and adjustment to external and internal demands. And I really think that flexibility and adjustment is a key part, right? So if we think about, yeah, the last 2.5 years have impacted young people in a certain way, but how can we promote a sense of flexibility, adjustment in a way that really fosters kind of this resilience, or this resilience lens to everything that has happened? And then they also go on in this definition to highlight that the things that can help people to adapt to adversity include the way they view and engage with the world. So really their perspective, their thinking, their reflection, which I think, and I'll talk about this later, but has a real connection to Ignatian pedagogy and Catholic social teaching as well. The availability of social resources, right? So that means their relationships, the people around them, and then having specific coping strategies. So having ways to handle that work for them as an individual. So that's kind of laying that groundwork of development, resilience, thinking about these broad ideas. So what have the last 2 years been like? Well, I think we all have a sense, and that first little activity really spoke to that. But I think I would also highlight that this has also been something that's really been out there in the media and in sort of our discourse as a society, right? That these things aren't necessarily hidden. It's not a hidden mental health crisis. It's one that we're explicitly talking about. It's not hidden that there have been issues with academics, and social skill development. Those are being talked about, and they're being put out there really strongly, I think, which is not to say that these articles are wrong or there's necessarily an overemphasis, but I just think it's important to note that this has been kind of something that is being talked about. And I think there's ways that we can positively use that. And I think there's also ways that tends to focus on a certain kind of negative deterministic framework a little bit. But it also wasn't only the pandemic, right? There've been a lot of other things that we've been thinking about these last 2 years, from racial and ethnic injustice and inequity and protests related to that, to January 6th and questions about democracy, to climate change, to school shootings and just mass shootings in general. So there's been a lot that these young people have been trying to sort of process through, and have been on the top of the kind of larger systemic discourse and that kind of macro system in Brofenbrenner's model. The areas of life, then, if we think that these have been impacted, and particularly with the pandemic, but with the others as well, right? They're socializing as their lives were disrupted, their routines, right? The things, how they went to school, right? The ways they went to school, their extracurricular activities, their key milestones. And some of these are coming back a little bit to, a sense of normality, but they still missed certain ones, right? So even if they're going to get to graduate from high school, they might not have graduated and had celebration from middle school or things like that, or family milestones or family celebrations were missed. Their schooling, obviously, with remote and hybrid and a lot of what happened in the last 2 years. Their communities were also deeply impacted, right? And these were also not equal in the sense of how those communities were impacted. There's, great disparities in terms of communities that lost more lives, that suffered more from COVID itself as a disease, but then also impacts related to who were essential healthcare workers, right? The economic impacts, things like that. And all of this, feeds into this sense of mental health and well-being and this challenge, right? All of these things. So there's so much and there's a lot that these young people are processing. We also have to think about that within the context, again, of their development. So something like the socializing might have been very different for a 7 or 8-year-old, and what that looked like if they were 7 and 8 in 2020 versus an 18-year-old, right? We need to think about that developmental context as well. Now, so some of the data on this, these are things I'm sure we've all seen, but I just kind of wanted to highlight, and this comes from a RAND report, but looking at the learning impacts and seeing, right, that these kind of learning gaps that they were finding in relation to 2020 and 2021, these were not equal either, right, by race or by income. They were more intense for Black and Hispanic students, or for those who were from lower household incomes. And then also for mental health, right? The mental health impacts, there's a lot of data that those were significant. And so, it's almost 2/5 of young people experienced poor mental health during 2020. And then 44% persistent feelings of sadness or hopelessness, right? So it might not have been sort of a poor mental health or a diagnosis, but it was still some intense feelings in relation to their emotions and their ability to sort of cope with what was going on. And those impacts are real, and I really want to kind of lay this groundwork for the rest of what I'm going to talk about is, I'm going to try and highlight on some resilience and it's kind of moving forward, but I also want to recognize that these impacts are real and that they intersect with these other inequities we have in our society. And we need to kind of keep this in mind and hold that even while we might take kind of a lens of how can we build, how can we move forward. One of the ways to start to think about that, I think, is looking at what did help students during this time. And so there's some good data. This is here out of the CDC, right? That connectedness at school, that relationships. And so what you're seeing there is really drastic differences in terms of these mental health measures for those students who felt close to people at school versus those who didn't feel close to people at school. And so, you see almost a 50% reduction there in attempted suicide. And then in those kind of persistent feelings of sadness, they were a lot lower as well. And so we're going to come back to this later, but I think, this speaks to these kind of things where we can take a look at this data and hold the challenge and the difficulty, but also be looking at what are the lessons and what are some of the ways we can build on this, and also try and support the young people coming out of this and really moving forward into the future. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the research that I've done. And again, this is really connecting into themes I've seen from broader research as well. But the kind of main takeaway I would say is that the pandemic, especially the sort of early part, and really I'm just thinking about sort of 2020 broadly, has been hard on young people, and specifically in terms of their academics, social connections, and mental health. And I don't think that's necessarily a surprise, but I also think for some of them, I'm seeing in these young people I work with in this data that we're analyzing, this has led to reflections on their resilience and feelings of personal growth. So they see these kind of ways that they're really growing and expanding upon that. And what I kind of want to highlight is that both can be true. And I think sometimes when we see those quantitative measures, we see, 44% of young people experience feelings of hopelessness and sadness. That's true and that's real and speaks to challenge and difficulty, but that also doesn't say what young people are taking away from that with them. How are they responding? What are the ways that they maybe are drawing on supports and learning about themselves or developing coping strategies? And we don't have that in kind of just a statistical measure like that. But some of that is, I think, coming through in some of this research that I've worked on with some colleagues. And so I want to set the stage for this kind of with a quote from one of these young people themselves, where they said, "The pandemic will be a point in my life where I learn to be alone with myself and grow as a person. I will look back and see it as a really hard point in my life. But in 5 years, I think I will be happy I came through it as a better person." And so this young person is really saying like, yeah, it stunk. It was difficult. It was hard, and they may have even experienced some things that would come up on one of those statistical measures. But they're also saying that what I'm taking with me is actually some of these positive lessons. And when I look back on it, I'm going to see kind of it through, I think, the person saying, I think through a lens of resilience rather than a lens of the kind of negative impacts it's had on my life. So the first research I'm going to speak to is the one that Kristin mentioned. I did this really with the support of the Jesuit Schools Network and some other schools and networks as well. And so I did some surveys in the spring of 2020, right after quarantines began, then in the fall of 2020, after school had returned. And those were two different samples. Some of the schools overlap, but I didn't match students across that. But then there was a group that did participate, a small group in both of those. And then I did follow-up interviews with them in the winter of 2021. So I asked them then sort of, how are you doing? How are you thinking about that? And so I had surveys from them from 2 time points and then interviews as well. And some of the key findings out of this, one of the points was in kind of, we had in the surveys really, they really had low levels of trust in a lot of things, but it was actually interesting because it was highest in schools. And so in this time in spring of 2020, particularly, but also in the fall, they talked about having low levels of trust in social media, in media, in some of the government, in political parties, but in people in general and in schools, it was still kind of high. But then also we've asked them measures that were related to hope or civic self-efficacy and social responsibility. So like, I can contribute to my community. And those were still really robust. So, even during these times, even when they were quarantined or even when things were kind of, chaotic and or maybe not chaotic, but sort of challenging, let's say in their school and their learning and was changing, with hybrid or remote or in person, they still felt these strong senses of this responsibility and this ability to contribute to their communities and also that hope that things would get better. They also spoke a lot about opportunities for personal growth. So seeing that within the challenge, within the isolation, things like I had a lot of time to reflect and be by myself, and that actually forced me to learn to be by myself, as some of them said, or I learned to manage my own time. They also redefine social identities and networks. And here I want to highlight is that the social isolation was really challenging. But for some of them, that actually gave them the space to redefine who they were. And so some of this was in relation to things like gender identity. Sometimes it was just friendships where they said like, hey, I learned who my friends really were. Or I got connected to a whole nother group of friends that I wouldn't have because I, had to go out and look for sort of an online chat group or something. And so there were ways that it was really challenging, but for some of them, it actually allowed a kind of reshaping and that sort of normal process in some ways of identity development in terms of their social context. And then the last is really to highlight that there were a lot of discussions and mention of stress and mental health impacts. So those were significant, right? Those came through in these surveys, these interviews about the real struggles that they were having. And so some of their own words from some of this, one young person who said, it's been awful. I can't keep up with my work and I have no motivation to do anything. Most days I just lay in my bed, unable to get up because of the amount of energy that school and schoolwork drains from me. And so this was in that first part in that spring, and you can really see that they're just feeling, a complete sort of sense of utter exhaustion due to everything that's going on and a lack of motivation. Another person was talking about some of the positives, kind of some of the takeaways and lessons that they learned. And they said, I think forming habits to help with like depression and anxiety and stuff, like working out or talking to people or journaling or meditation, like come into those. So they were saying basically that they struggled with things, but also that they then learned these are the kind of things that work for me. Like when I am feeling sort of anxious, maybe I need to go work out or I need to talk to someone. And so they learned coping strategies because of what they were struggling with during that time. The second part of research that I've conducted is on the transition to college. And so this began last fall and only at Marquette. And so we had a cohort of students that we surveyed, and then we did a number of interviews and we followed up with those same students in the spring. And so those were first year students. They were ones who had been juniors during 2020 at the beginning of the pandemic. And then they were transitioning to college in the fall of 2021. And now we've started this academic year with a multi-institution. So we're doing a second cohort at Marquette. So first year students this year. And then we're also working with Fordham and Loyola New Orleans to do a little bit more of a comparative part across these different universities. So some of the things we're seeing from this sort of first round of interviews, the first is struggle. So there's a lot of talk about struggle for motivation, and not in the current context, but really from the past. They talk about their remembrance of high school and the impacts that COVID had on their learning was particularly a struggle for motivation. They also talked about struggling with time management. And this kind of went two ways. Some of them said that this basically made their learning kind of a mess, and others where they felt like they were able to develop their own ways to manage their time. Because things like their routine, their structures, right? Even the amount of work that they had to do, where they did the work, because some of them, that home and school context really kind of became blended together. But so there were a lot of challenges there with time management. Learning online, this was, pretty much 100% across the board that the learning online was really difficult for them. Some of them talked about the social part being easier and that maybe made their learning a little easier because they didn't have to feel the anxiety of being in a classroom. But almost across the board, it was, harder, they said, to ask questions of teachers. It was harder to be engaged. They found that a really difficult experience. And then they really highlighted too the social isolation. And that was really a strong thing that they remembered, and not just from their friends, but from family, from other people, just kind of being physically isolated, and that meaning socially isolated as well. What is important, I think, also to highlight, given the context of this generation being so connected, they're a generation that grew up with a lot of them, depending on resources, obviously, but a lot of them with the prevalence of smartphones, right, or social media for the last decade of their lives, but still they felt very socially isolated during 2020. Then in terms of emerging resilience that comes out of that, a lot of them spoke to coping strategies. And I think particularly they spoke to these in relation to mental health concerns. So they drew on a lot of language in mental health. It wasn't just saying that like I was sort of unmotivated and couldn't get out of my bed, but specifically saying like I feel like I felt depressed and then I had to cope with it in this way. They also talked about study habits. A lot of them that they developed study habits. And this was kind of again, one of these sort of, it went two ways, and we had significant numbers in both groups where some really felt like they developed strong study habits, or the ones they had became stronger. And then others felt like, well, I didn't take a test for 2 years, so I don't know how to take tests now in college. And so we're worried about that. But it felt like there was a lot of kind of divergence, and you really heard strongly those two parts in relation to study habits. Exercise, there's a lot of evidence that across the board, young people in 2020 were impacted negatively in terms of their physical activity. But a lot of these young people spoke to that, particularly in relation to coping, as sort of a positive thing, that they had more time to take walks outside. So it wasn't necessarily that they were going to the gym or they were in their sports extracurriculars, but that they were seeing sort of exercise and activity in a different way, and they were having more time to engage in that, and those kind of long walks outside, and some of them in running or doing things in their home to keep themselves fit. And then values. There's a lot of referring to really now, kind of 2 years down the road, thinking about what matters to them or what they prioritize, or feeling a sense of gratitude. There's a lot of discussion of that as these young people start to reflect back a little bit. And I think thinking about, what that time and what that sort of turmoil and disruption really made me realize was, what are certain things that mattered to me? And sometimes that was also particularly in relation to family. That family really mattered, or my family bonds became stronger. And then the last part there to highlight is a lot of them now are talking about the power of sort of, I quote it, quote unquote, normal senior year. But this idea that last year for them in high school was a much more stable year. And I think this is true for a lot of folks across a lot of levels of schooling. And that was really powerful for these folks. So described like, coming to college, having had 1 year that felt like we had sort of returned to a little bit, or I was able to, take tests again or be back in my school regularly. That was a really important experience for them as they move forward in their lives. So in their own words, again, drawing on some of these young people and what they told us, one who said, I was just like, what's the point of studying? Going to college was like, is there really a point in any of this? So I was just having like a lot of second doubts, and I wouldn't say I was depressed, but I was just sad about it, just sad about life. And I would put this in the context of saying this person did end up going to college, right? They're at one of our institutions. And, that's important to highlight that the data that we're gathering in these young people are ones that had some resilience because they are now in college. But so this person went through a really difficult time, and they didn't feel like there was any point on continuing on with their academics, but they did. And the second one, so that kind of helped me. Just like a lot of thinking about myself, like what my values were, what I wanted to do with my life, or where I wanted my life to head out to. And so that person spent a lot of time reflecting on that kind of last part that I was talking about with the values during the pandemic and with all that time and kind of disruption. So sort of summarizing our research, I really want to highlight these impacts are real, and the young people are telling us this. They had learning struggles. Some of them are now still carrying over some of those struggles in their classes or taking tests, things like that, their study habits. They had real mental health struggles, and the disruption to their social networks were real. But at the same point, the responses are varied. And here's where I kind of want to try and add a little more complexity to some of the discourses and narratives that are out there, and really allow us kind of in working with young people, but the young people themselves, to really share and to think about and sit with some of the responses that weren't necessarily just kind of negative and just about the challenge, but about things like that tie into coping and resilience and personal growth. And so we want to be able to kind of sit with both of those. The real challenge, and for some people that's still lasting in certain ways, but for others, there are also kind of these ways that they've grown and they've really been able to build on and sort of show a sense of resilience in relation to that. And a lot of that's tied into the supports that they had around them as well. So then thinking about this and kind of more broadly about some of the research and literature in this area, what can we do to support students now? And so the lessons for 2022, right, is we're 2 years out, and they're showing kind of that disruption of that weird year in 2020 when things were a bit different. But I want to sort of highlight here again this idea of development, and that's what I wanted to show here, the sense of like, the first thing we want to be thinking about is where kids were at, particularly in 2020 and 2021. So as time passes, we're going to get cohorts who are not directly experiencing the impacts of the pandemic, but they are still carrying with them the kind of the legacies, particularly of those years that were particularly difficult, and when those hit them developmentally. So if they were, 8 and 9, the things that they were trying to do academically, the things and challenges socially, right, and psychosocially as well, those are different, and those are going to carry forth in some ways. This is not going to be kind of just a flip the switch back to normal, and we can leave that in the past, or that everyone is affected the same way, either because of their age or because of their individualness as well. But so one of the things is understanding that these impacts will be long-term, and that kind of builds on what I was just saying, right? I think even if we say get, a whole cohort of young people back to where they were in learning, and we see the, those gaps that we see all the time come out in research, if those even up, there's still going to be impacts that these folks are going to be carrying with them, these young people, in the long term. When you look at research and data from the Great Depression, right, there's some really interesting research that was done with folks who were adolescents then, and those impacts lasted their whole life, right? And those weren't always necessarily negative, and that's a lesson I keep going back to. But they held that with them, right? There were things about them that looked different than people who were 16 through 18, 10 years before or 10 years after the Great Depression. And I think we need to be thinking of that in a similar way, that the impacts from this are going to be carrying forth into the long term for these young people. The second is really, and this is, I think, something that's clear for all of us who work with young people, but we have to attend to the students' mental health and the stress. And I know it's a constant challenge on how do we attend to that without maybe, say, lowering our expectations, or with still holding them to high standards. Those kind of questions can be a real struggle and challenge. But I think, the things that I think about, particularly in relation to the mental health, are, we need increased resources. And this is at every level. We need increased resources in the communities. We need increased resources in schools, right? In terms of counseling and therapeutic services, here I'm really thinking. But then to that second point, we can really start to think about this as spreading the work. And what I mean by that is not that we want to put another thing on our teachers to say, you also need to be handling students when they're dealing with extreme depression, but rather to be thinking of this kind of like holistically as like well-being, and how do we already, and then how can we further support that holistic sense of well-being and do that across the board, that's not just in sort of spaces that are traditionally thought of as mental health, like a counseling center. And, I really think I was part of the group that worked on the JSN pop-up survey, the most recent one. And part of what we were trying to get at was a sense of like, how are we already doing that work? Let's kind of recognize this and let's try and build on that. So, what are the kinds of conversations and ways that we support students' mental health and well-being in our day in, day out lives as educators in these schools? The other part is training to that idea. So, things like mental health first aid, or just having explicit discussions and professional development that's centered around how can we, in working with young people, support, again, their overall well-being as well, but then identify when they're really in crisis and need that support. That's something that I'm really trying to push for at the university level, I'll say too, because, often instructors, when a student, let's say, disappears or forgets an assignment, you reach out to them and they send you an email back, and it might be something referring to their mental health, and we need to know how to respond to that, other than just saying, here's the counseling center, give them a call. And the last part is thinking about barriers and stigma. And I actually think here, there's been a lot of progress, and a lot of progress over the last decade, but particularly the last 2 years, where young people are taking it on themselves to say, hey, we're going to talk about mental health, we're going to talk about our well-being, and we're going to also advocate for getting better supports for it. And there's a story that I tell about a fellowship last summer here in Milwaukee, where a number of students of color, young people, were brought together, and they had a summer of sort of professional development and training, and then we're also asked to sort of come up with projects that they felt would address some of the deepest concerns that young people were facing in relation to their education, like their peers. And one of the main themes across those projects, which were then taken to fruition, they were sort of supported and these students helped make them a reality, were ones related to mental health. So, these are students of color and young people of color. Historically, there have been very high barriers to talking about and accessing mental health resources. And this was what they took on and said, this is what we need. Because I think some of those barriers and stigma, they're getting used to talking about it, hearing about it, thinking about it, and advocating for it as well. Second is, this kind of theme that I've talked about throughout, which is we don't want to minimize the challenge. We don't want to minimize the struggle and what folks have gone through in the last 2 years, but we also want to recognize and encourage growth. And I think here there's a real opportunity, particularly in Jesuit schools, with this emphasis on reflection, on the cura personalis, and we can kind of hold these two together and really help young people think through this, what it means for themselves as individuals, and then, as people in their families and their communities and part of the school. The last point is this kind of focus on connectedness. There's a lot of great emphasis and research on connectedness just being so critical, not only kind of for attendance or for school climate or things like that, but really for mental health and well-being for young people. And I showed you that that kind of statistic before from the CDC, but then I also just think, we can think of this in so many broad ways, and is impacting so many parts of our school communities and as young people. And I think if we really devote that attention to connectedness across levels in our schools, that can really help. And I'm really struck by, I read recently this book, The Stolen Year, which is by an NPR reporter. And she kind of does this really great deep dive into all of the ways that 2020, 2021 was such an incredibly difficult year for young people and their learning, in particular types of young people based on their identities and their experiences and resources. But she's got this one point where she's talking to a child psychologist and, and thinking about what's the way forward. And the child psychologist just says connection is the cure. And that really stuck with me, this idea of we need to focus on building connection for young people, across young people and with young people. And that's something that schools are really set up well to do, and I think particularly Jesuit schools as well. And this kind of ties into this idea as well of a framework of sort of what a mental health friendly school is. And so this is a school that enables social connections, communicates achievable expectations, and helps kids develop a sense of purpose. And this is from a recent report called Mental Health in Gen Z that was released by the Springtide Research Institute. And again, here, we see the primary one, this is focused on a mental health friendly school, is about connection. But I think the second two are also really critical for thinking about our Jesuit schools, where we do have, high achievement or high expectations for students, but want to really make sure we're communicating those and communicating in those a way that really resonates and helps students know that they can get there, particularly after all the disruption they've gone through that might have impacted a sense of efficacy or a sense of being able to accomplish those things. And then lastly, that sense of purpose. I think that's right there at the core of a Jesuit education is, what is my purpose, right? What is God calling me to do? Who am I, right? And then also that cura personalis, as I mentioned before. So what can this look like then? A couple of sort of concrete ideas and thoughts. First, figuring out what their experience of the pandemic means to them, giving space for young people to share that. So rather than saying it's about the loss you had or the learning, let's say we take a look at our state scores and we say, gosh, our kids are, scoring so much worse than they were 5 years ago, right? Well, that's putting an experience of pandemic on them, but let's give them space too to share their own and make meaning of that for themselves. And within that, really encouraging discussion and sharing and building on ways they might have coped or what things they might have learned about themselves. So giving them that space to talk about the experience, but then also kind of that like silver lining or that possibility of what lessons or learning did they get out of that. And then also thinking about this building long-term resilience across the educational community. And when I talk about the kind of mental health friendly schools, I'm thinking about that, but I'm also thinking about the attention to teachers and their mental health and well-being, right? And there's, a lot of evidence of burnout and that kind of issue in question. I'm also thinking about the sort of broader community that the school is embedded with, the things, the inequities or the challenges they might be facing and how we can advocate for change or draw on those resources and strengths from that community to make the educational one even stronger and have that long-term resilience. And then I think, to the connection point, really engaging and taking the time for community building activities. There's a lot of focus now on, we need to figure out how we can get kids up to speed in their learning, and we need to address that they have these mental health concerns and issues. And I think underlying both of that, there needs to be attention and space for let's proactively and intentionally build community, because that got disrupted, and that's kind of a core and an underlying part of all of these other things that we're seeing. And then I kind of mentioned this before, but some of the synergies with the Jesuit educational mission. So I think, Jesuit education really is set up well to create space for young people to process and to think through some of what I was just talking about. I think also for help promoting and providing meaning and that sense of purpose, which then ties into the resilience, right? If we think about the finding God in all things, we think about kind of the magis that can all really feed into that. The building connections as well. I mean, these schools are really talked about as communities, and some of the research I've done with some of the schools, even a couple that are on the call here, these young people will talk about it as like a family, or they'll talk about it as, the connections they have to that school, that identity. And so I think that that's something that we can really double down on, and that'll really help. And, that's a part of that Jesuit educational mission. And then, the academics and social schools, their skills, there are gaps there. And I think our schools are set up well because we do ask a lot of our students. And the social part, that is a core part of that formation, right? It's not just about getting our students to get into great top level colleges, but it's for them to graduate and really have that formational part as well, to be men and women and people for others. So there, I do want to end it to kind of open up a chance for any conversations. I think we have at least sort of like 10 minutes or so we can talk about things. here all together. But again, I'm always happy to follow up, and I will put my email as well in the chat. And so I'll stop sharing my screen now and open it up to any questions, responses, feedback, pushback, or anything that you would like to share.
And this would be a great time if you are in a spot where you are able to turn your camera on. It would, I think, allow more of a kind of faculty room feel, which would be great for the Q&A. So if that's fitting for where you are. And please feel free to go ahead and just jump in, and we can utilize the time that we have left here with Gabriel. Who would like to go first?
Let me also just note really quick, I'm sorry, I noticed someone mentioned that you couldn't see the word cloud before. So I will try and get that into the chat. I think I was sharing in Zoom just my PowerPoint, but I will try and get that to you as well so you can see what came up out of that.
Thank you, Dr. Velez. This is Matt DeBoer, Crisis in Minneapolis. And I'm just curious, I was a principal the previous 8 years, and one of the things that hit the schools as well was just like the staff mass exoduses. And obviously that's not the focus of your research, but I'm curious if, because schools can be that place of connection, if you've come across any of that, kind of those who stayed, I guess, like words of hope for staff who've stayed through, because a lot of people switch professions or just like use that break. Just anything on that, staff retention, like giving hope to adults to stay in the game.
Yeah. So that is so real. And I will say, as just like a person and a former teacher, I can only imagine what it's been like for educators these last couple of years. And the JSN did that first pop-up survey that was on burnout, and I saw some of that results in that kind of quantitative way. What I would say out of this is, it is so striking how many of these young people speak to the ways that teachers were there for them and other people in schools. And I really think that that was so powerful for the ones who got that. Now, not everyone did, and that CDC kind of graph speaks to that. But I think when they did, that was really life altering for them, in a time that was so difficult, when a teacher, was understanding. That was a big part when they talked about like the teachers understand that it's difficult. And even last year, we were seeing that with the folks at college, where they said when a teacher understood that like we're not back to normal yet and gave some grace, and that's just a kind of like a simple level. And then the ones who had the relationships and talked about like, yeah, when I was able to talk with my teacher and we shared about this, maybe after class still on Zoom or something, those were really powerful in making them feel, I think, not only connected to their school, but also just to help them process through what was going on. And so, I think one of the things I might offer is that, that I think a lot of us, particularly a lot of all of you are educators in these schools, you've done a lot of work that's been behind the scenes, but you're always constantly doing little things with the students. And I think putting them first and building relationships with them, and those really do have salience for them. And salience, even when they're talking to, a researcher and maybe a couple years down the road. So, not necessarily just back to your face or in that moment, but those things stay with them. And I think, going to that point on connectedness, that's really what we need now. And, that doesn't solve all the demands and all that teachers are being asked of in a difficult time. But I think hopefully for some, it'll give a little even more support for encouragement that this, that young people really value this work that you're doing.
Thank you.
This is Jim Grogan at BC High in Boston. You talked about students who were able to kind of look at things through a lens of resilience. Did you identify factors that really contributed to students being able to do that? Being able to cope and develop, a sense of personal growth. What went into that?
Yeah. So I think there are a couple things there. I think what was interesting to me was there wasn't a lot who spoke to outside structure. So there were very few who spoke to like being asked to do that. Some of them who I think were already tied into therapeutic services, they did speak to that. So they would say like, either I was already seeing a therapist or I started seeing one, and they suggested I journal. Let's say something like that, right? And then they said, and that was really positive for me, or that was a good takeaway. But there were a lot who did it really on their own, but I think on their own with in other parts of the interviews or in the surveys, it was clear that they had really good family supports or good family connections, or they didn't feel like they were completely sort of lost in their motivation in school or drowning with their schoolwork. So I think it's kind of like for the folks who had the resources in terms of like the mental health, that really encouraged them. For some other folks, when they were given a little bit of stability amongst all this time, they were kind of forced to sort of think and reflect on it. And I think some of them that worked out well. And that's where I kind of think that there's a real space too for this Jesuit mission, because there weren't a lot of kids at all who were saying like, my school was asking me to think through this, or my school was asking me. And I think we can occupy that space. When I think of my own experience on retreats in high school, and all the young people I've heard talk about retreats, like those are a great space for the school to be in there saying like, hey, let's talk about your takeaways or your lessons, or let's process this. And so, I would say that in the data, it was kind of, that was as I mentioned, sort of those who were having the mental health supports, those who just had to think things around them that help stabilize their situation. But I think there's a real opportunity in terms of the school helping promote that. Yeah. I saw there's a question in the chat too about disaggregated data for students identifying as LGBT. And that's a really great question. And I don't have that. And that's a question we didn't actually ask the students. What I will say is there was a little bit that came up in that social part when we asked about social things, with some of those students talking about feeling a sense of like a positive sense, actually, because that they hadn't felt in their schools before the pandemic really like social support, or that sometimes they were facing bullying or questions like that, concerns like that, and that the move to remote actually kind of allowed them a little bit of a sense of sort of liberation from some of those stressors of their social lives related to their identities. But that's all I can speak to directly. I think in the broader research, though, across the country, there's a lot of evidence that LGBTQ students have actually been disconnected from some of their social supports, or were during that 2020-2021 time. And then I think there's a growing little bit of evidence that there's been a little bit more, there's, I say this kind of hesitantly because it's not necessarily 100% clear, but there's some folks who are saying they're finding data that it gave those students an opportunity to sort of explore their identities a little bit more, again, because they're kind of, everything was sort of disrupted, and they were, out of the kind of usual almost inertia of their social contexts. And so even though they were disrupted from resources, and some of those who are already out in certain ways where those kind of identities had connection to resources and they lost that, for others, it was actually a chance to explore their identity without what they might have felt were like the repercussions in kind of their day in, day out social lives before the pandemic.
If I can offer an observation too, I work with juniors and seniors actually, and in particular this fall, I've read a lot of essays, college essays, and I think that the distance between the virtual period and the hybrid period, in other words, you talked about a normal senior year. I think that our students had a bit of a normal junior year. I know that you were talking about college students there, and a normal senior year, and they've been able to be amazingly reflective. So I'm really wonderfully stunned by some of the things that they're writing about, discoveries, self-discoveries, finding resilience in meditation, things that honestly that we didn't necessarily offer them. They might have been offered here and there, but they weren't offered institutionally, and they found them because they need them, and now they share them. So it is happening, and I think what you talked about is things are happening here. We need to build on them. I think those are the kinds of things that I've been sharing around, not personal information about students, but sharing around how students have found coping mechanisms and really resilience through the whole thing. So, a term that was used at the colloquium this summer was the idea of survival genius. We all have in us a survival genius. And so when we need it, I love the term. I've used it a lot. I think it says a lot to me about what's really happening here. So that's what I see. And by the way, thank you very much for this. This has been wonderful.
Thank you. Yeah, no, that's great to hear that sort of input, because it helps round it out for me, because you all, work so closely with these kids in so many different ways. And I think that's so interesting about the college essay being that space too for the reflective kind of component.
I hate
I just have one quick question, Kristin. We've talked a lot about the difference between the contexts here in North Philadelphia and some of the other schools that you've been working with. I'm wondering if there's any movement about a developmental matrix along the lines that you just shared about. Here's what you can expect if your kids went through COVID during, 5th through 7th grade. Here's what you can expect if they went through freshman and sophomore year. I just don't know if any of that work's been done.
I haven't seen anything, but that's a really great point. I'm actually working on, this is in the academic world, and sometimes that doesn't, academics are not thinking as well about the transferable part. But I'm working on a special issue of a journal related to COVID impacts. And I think I might try and see if we can find someone to do something like that. Because I think you're right, like to have something laid out really clearly of like, based on what we know about development across these times, these are the things. And then, it could be based on what we know, the theory, this is the data on the ways that we've seen these impacts play out. Here's what we can be looking for. I haven't seen that, but if I do it, I'll make sure to send it along to you.
Thanks.
I hate to cut our Q&A period short, because I feel like there's enough here that we could go on for a long time, but I want to be mindful of your time here in the middle of your school day. I have to thank you, Gabriel, for so much relevant work to the lives of educators and kids and leaders in our schools. Now, there's so much that resonated with me. First and foremost, the quote, "Connection is the cure." I think it's really powerful to think about one of the takeaways as we move forward, and that idea of devoting attention to connectedness. And how do we do that? That the simple act of feeling close to people in schools helps young people with their feelings of support and connectedness. And then using that language of mental health friendly schools, and what does that really look like? And I know that so many of the folks that are on the call here are really working through that and wrestling with that as we speak. The ideas of students looking back on the challenges of the pandemic and being able to see and to tease out the opportunities for personal growth and the coping strategies and that spirit of resilience that we know is important. And like Ed, it really struck me. I don't think I had thought about it before. This idea of our students, our children, carrying with them legacies of the pandemic into the future. It really is interesting. Everyone now is kind of treading water and working through the immediate and all that needs to be done. But to think about how, like any big point in our history, that there is not a flip. I think, as Gabriel said, a flip the switch back to normal, that the impacts are really long-term. So this is something that we're figuring out now as we go, but that will continue to go with us as we enroll students well into the future. So that's both encouraging, but also challenging, I think, to speak about. And then the biggest idea of how do we further support well-being for day in and day out for our educators who are grappling with this work, and not just that of the counselors, but of everyone really in schools. I appreciated the question too of the parallel that we're making here of offering faculty and the adults hope that we're thinking about here with students and creating space for that. So there is so much to be said here, and we really appreciate the time. I hope that Dr. Velez's work has kind of sparked something of resonance to you as you work through these many important issues. So we will look to promote this video and kind of share it around, and I'll make sure that you all get it that are on the call, and I would ask you to please share it as you see fit within your communities. And I'll ask Gabriel too if you might be willing to share the slides that he has offered you here too for increased increased context. So thank you for taking the time to be here this afternoon. We really appreciate it, especially in a busy holiday week. And most importantly, happy Thanksgiving to you and your families. So all the best.
Thank you, everyone.